Welcome, everyone. We're going to give just another half a minute or so. I see the participant numbers are going up, so we'll give just another half a minute or so to let people continue to join us. But welcome to our webinar today. All right, we have a full session today, so we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to our Navigation to Clinical Trials webinar series. My name is Heather Ciccarelli. I'm the Director of the Patient Navigation Initiative here at the American Cancer Society. The initiative is one element of the American Cancer Society's overall strategic investment in patient navigation, provides an opportunity for participants to develop competencies and skills to advance high-quality cancer care through innovative and sustainable models of oncology patient navigation, all the while decreasing health disparities and increasing health equity. The program's divided into two components. The first includes $300,000 individual grants to 20 healthcare systems across the United States and Puerto Rico, awarded post a competitive application process. Each grant supports an established navigation program for 30 months with a goal to enhance said programs and address barriers and challenges impacting patient recipient of high quality cancer care. All the while, the grantees are collecting data to measure the impact of their strategies to improve patient access to and completion of care. Grantees are participating in a bi-monthly learning community that allows the participants to share and hear about the experiences, expertise, and lessons of successful patient navigation programs and help improve patient navigation as practice. Evaluation and outcome measures of the grantees will be analyzed with the intent of informing the larger oncology navigation community and to contribute to future programming and policy development. The second program component is a webinar series designed to share expert content on relevant topics in patient navigation. The overarching theme is advancing equity through patient navigation. And on behalf of the American Cancer Society, I am proud to introduce our first series. This webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording will be made available later this week via email. During the session today, we will not be able to open the mics for you to ask your questions verbally during the large live webinar because there'd be too much feedback through our microphones. Instead, please post any questions you may have during the webinar in the question and answer box in the Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen, and our moderator will do our best to answer them during the Q&A period at the end of this webinar. I would like to thank our sponsors today. This webinar and the Patient Navigation Initiative is supported by our sponsors, AstraZeneca, Janssen, Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, GlaxoSmithKline, Novocure, Daiichi, Sanko, Santa Fe, and other funders, and we're so grateful for their support. This series will be moderated by the National Navigation Roundtable co-chairs, and today's moderator is Linda Fleischer. Dr. Fleischer is a research professor at Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She is the vice chair of the ACS NNRT and also serves on the evidence-based task group. Dr. Fleischer has been involved in the patient education and navigation for over 30 years, directing one of the regional offices of the NCI's Cancer Information Service, establishing the Fox Chase Cancer Center Resource Education Center, the PA Patient Navigation Demonstration Project, and other research projects integrating patient navigation. I'm pleased to introduce to you Linda Fleischer, who served as our moderator today.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's really such a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be kicking off this three-part webinar series, which is going to focus on the importance of oncology clinical trials, processes for addressing patient barriers, preventing participation in clinical trials, and practices for navigating patients through clinical trials. So this is really exciting, and we are especially delighted today to have Dr. Robert Wynn with us, who is going to kick off this series and provide the foundation for our ongoing discussions. It was really critical that we examine the contextual and social issues that underpin our work in addressing health disparities and health equity in cancer care, and which, of course, impacts clinical trial participation. These go hand in hand. These issues are integral to our work in patient navigation, and it really is truly an honor to have you here with us, Dr. Robert Wynn, and it's so nice to see you. But I would like to do an introduction so everyone has a better sense. I think many know Dr. Wynn, but I would really like to do a proper introduction to set him off on his presentation. So as director of the VCU Massey Cancer Center, Robert Wynn oversees a National Cancer Institute designated cancer center that provides advanced cancer care, conducts groundbreaking research to discover new therapies for cancer, offers high quality education and training, and engages with the community to make advancements in cancer treatment and prevention equally available to all. Really critical. He is leading the nation in establishing a 21st century model of equity for cancer science and care, in which the community is informing and partnering with Massey on its research to best address the cancer burden and disparities of those within the cancer center that serves, but a local focus with a global impact. His current basic science research, which has been supported by multiple NIH and VA merit awards, focuses on the molecular mechanisms and novel therapeutic approaches for human models of lung cancer. He has authored or co-authored more than 80 published manuscripts in peer-reviewed academic journals. In addition to that, right, he, as a pulmonologist, Dr. Wynn is committed to community-engaged research centered on eliminating health disparities. He is the principal investigator on several community-based projects funded by the NIH and NCI, including the All of Us Research Program, which is an NIH precision medicine initiative. He has nearly 20 years commitment to the Veterans Affairs Health Services and held appointments at the Denver VA and Jesse Brown VA in Chicago, where he established the first multidisciplinary pulmonary module clinic. And in addition to his research and his work, he is president-elect of the Association of American Cancer Institutes and serves on the board of directors for the American Cancer Society, the Longevity Foundation, as well as the Academy of Oncology Nurse and Patient Navigators Leadership Council. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors and has received the NCI Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities Cure Program Lifetime Achievement Award, the American Association for Cancer Research Minorities and Cancer Research Jane Cook Wright Lectureship, the AACI Cancer Health Equity Award, and the Prevent Cancer Foundation Cancer Prevention and Early Detection Laurel Award for increasing health equity. And he is a member of the National Cancer Policy Forum of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and of several other professional societies, really bringing his work, his expertise, and his vision to many of these organizations as they really address health equity. And perhaps the last thing that I know is dear to him, in 2022, the Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation Diversity in Clinical Trials Career Development Program was renamed the Robert A. Wynn Diversity in Clinical Trials Award Program, which is committed to increasing diversity in clinical trials and training the new generation of community-oriented clinical researchers. So Dr. Wynn, it really is such a pleasure to have you here and to really set the stage for this important series on health equity and clinical trials. So I will turn it over to you.
First of all, I just want to say, Linda and Heather, thank you. And thank you for what you all do and your leadership. I'm a proud ACS member and couldn't be prouder. I mean, talk about an organization that really is about making people first, making communities visible. It runs throughout our entire DNA and our blood with the ACS, which is why I really just want to thank you all for inviting me to kicking this off with the roundtable. I'll start by a couple things, making sure that I'm completely transparent. If there was ever a question of whether I love science, let me just be upfront that if loving science is wrong, I don't want to be right. I love science. At heart, I love going to my laboratory with the RNA binding proteins and looking at all these things. But I also want to be absolutely transparent that it was clear to me that while I love getting molecules that become medicine, that the back half of this story is that if the medicines don't get to only some, but not to all, then what really are we doing? There is actually also a second awakening, if you will, or maybe in fact, some people call things revolution. I'm going to call this a evolution of my own person and my own science of recognizing that while it is good to go from a bench and create these things and get it to the bedside, that many, many, many of our missing millions don't get access to these miracle drugs. Why? Because we forget the basic blocking and tackling of the importance of not just high tech, but high touch. So let me frame the rest of this talk in the context of why I believe certainly in science and high tech, but I also believe in high touch. What's rooted in the ACS is this issue of connectedness. And hopefully the rest of this talk, as if I'm able to share my screen, and I think I am, we will be able to talk about the why high touch actually matters. So I'm going to go ahead and start with actually a couple of my favorite quotes. People who know me, I always start off my talks with what I call things that frame or center me. One of them is this quote by Mark Twain that says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Now, I hate to admit it, but we are certainly surrounded by a number of brilliant people throughout history who sometimes were absolutely sure, as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, of some issues. And it turns out that sometimes with more knowledge and more data, it turns out just not to be so. Why do I put this? Because what I love about the ACS, and particularly under its current leadership and what you all are doing on the ground level, is that the ACS, right from its inception, understood that to make progress, you also had to have one secret sauce and a secret element to that secret sauce, and that's called humility. The humility of understanding that while we are creating some of the best miracle drugs on the planet, the humility allows us as an organization to understand that we have to also be effective communicators with our communities. That leads me to this second slide, which I really love this one. And so if someone really gets angry in the science community, don't take it out on me. Bring this one up with Albert Einstein. So it's not me saying this, but it's not everything that counts can be counted. And not everything that can be counted counts. For me, this is important in the context of why, as an organization, we are paying attention to how can we get people onto clinical trials, but also how can we take care of those families and those patients when they're getting their care. Let me not beat around the bush and tell you that while the Hope Lodges may not be something that is academic in our ivy-covered halls, it counts. It matters. And what I love about what we're about to do, and when I get an opportunity to do when I represent the ACS, is to bring our science closer to our communities. Let me set the stage with disparities, because as we think about these issues of navigation and the importance of clinical trials, let me set the stage that we all know that we can certainly do a better job across the entire United States in getting more people onto clinical trials. But we have to be aware that there is a significant need to get our at-risk populations, our rural populations, and our at-risk, minority groups onto these trials. Before I start, though, I just want to point out to you all that most of what we talk about when we talk about health disparities, let me just set the record straight, ain't new. I said it. Most of the issues that we continue to have in 2023 were written about in 1899 by one of the greatest social scientists of his time, W.E.B. Du Bois. So let's not get it twisted that these are new issues that we're dealing with in the realm of health disparities. Let me also recognize that we couldn't get to the clinical trials without the folks that are listed here. The famous Photo 51 by both Watson, Crick, and Franklin allowed us as human beings to, for the first time, start looking and poking around, understanding the nature of the human cells. Once we actually started understanding the science and actually being able to come up with the tools of understanding the nature of human cells, it actually started having and producing people like the David Baltimores that were looking at reverse transcriptase, Phil Sharp, who ultimately led in the split genes that becomes now the splice genes, and James Allison, as many of you know, around immunotherapy. The science in and of itself was good and certainly brought forth good knowledge, but the science in and of itself, without being connected to then the clinical and the translational aspect, would have fallen on deaf ears. That progression, that understanding, that bringing forth fundamental knowledge in and of itself was good, but that translating that into real medicines, into real translational activities, was really where the game was going to be played. And Nixon and Ted Kennedy and others in 1971 led to not only the NCI designation cancer centers that were the first three then back in 1971, now there's 71 of us, but that led to, as part of the war on cancer, this concept that science and research matter. I don't think anyone would disagree that from 1950 till now, that we certainly have made some progress. We all know that 1 in 5 people will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime, almost 20 million a year. We know that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime, and at least close to 2 million new cancers are expected to be diagnosed this year. But what we also know is that cancer, many of the cancers, not all of them, can be reduced, and in some cases can even be prevented. It turns out that approximately 20% of all cancers diagnosed in the US are caused by a combination of excess body weight, physical inactivity, excess alcohol consumption, and poor nutrition. And by the way, let's stop talking about these as if this is an individual problem and not one built on structure. When you see someone who actually doesn't get physical inactivity, in my old days when I was trained as a medical student and as I was trained as a junior faculty person, it was always, well, what could you do as opposed to what could we do to allow communities to have more choices, to allow communities to actually have access to more activities that are health promoting. So while it is true that loving science is something that I absolutely cannot deny, I also can't deny the fact that focusing on just molecules to medicine, while necessary to fight cancer, is not sufficient to eradicate it or bring about equity. This is the context of, again, work from, as you know, Jamel and everybody, they're just fantastic people. We know that through their cancer facts and figures and the work that they do, that there still is a significant difference between the outcomes of, say, Black communities and white communities. We also know that there is a substantial negative, right, outcome in the context of rural communities versus urban. The work isn't going to be just only in the context of the creation of the new miracle drug. It's going to be in the high touch area of how do we get these access to these miracle drugs into the hopper in all hands. I don't even need to tell you that inequities still exist. I mean, almost in every area. We know that there are two, if you're an African-American male, you're 2 times more likely than your white counterpart to die from prostate cancer. We know that there are higher rates of African-American women dying from breast cancer, et cetera, et cetera. We also know, and I'll stop for a second and tell you that if you were a 70-year-old man and you had the choice between living in Salt Lake, Utah versus Beattyville, Kentucky, always go with the Salt Lake, Utah. You may ask why. Well, it turns out that we focus a lot on race. But I'm going to actually say that when we're talking about our clinical trials and we're talking about our navigation efforts, that we start focusing in beyond race to place and space. Let me break that down just a little bit. Let me explain to you that, for example, a 70-year-old white male living in Beattyville, Kentucky is 3 times more likely to have cancer and is 3 times more likely to actually have a poorer outcome than a 17-year-old white male living in Salt Lake, Utah. The other thing I wanted to point out, and believe me, I am a big fan, huge fan of clinical trials, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I don't want to lose sight for all of us of the work that we actually have to do as roundtables in the context of navigation and activation. And I'll come back to this concept of community activators. When we think of scientific progress, many of us will give each other high fives and we'll give ourselves high fives. So the wonderful job we've done, except for the fact that when you look at the data over the decades, when we've introduced things like mammography of colorectal cancer screening, we've actually inadvertently introduced disparities and inequities. You may say, Dr. Nguyen, what are you talking about? Turns out if you go back to the SEER registry data for both of those, you can almost to the minute see where the mammographies were introduced and where the mammographies wound up. That then showed an explosion of a difference between Black and white women when it came to breast cancer and Black and white communities when it came to colorectal screening. Let's not play the fact, and let's not lie to one another, that just because we have scientific progress in early detection, new technologies, new medicines, that those are equally getting, and even new trials, that they're equally getting out to everyone at the same time in the same manner. It's this point that I would like for this group to even lock in on even more, because when I think how we're really going to eradicate cancer, in fact, in 1971, they were so bold as to make the statement that they were going to eradicate cancer by 1981. I submit to you that we've made substantial progress with just understanding the fundamental knowledge of research and understanding the nature of the human cells. It is certainly necessary, but it is insufficient in the context of eradicating cancer if we're not paying as much attention to the high touch approaches. I say this because as we enter into the era of a multi-cancer early detection, as we enter into the era of precision medicine, let us not make the same mistake in understanding that just the medicine alone is not enough. Now, let me be clear when I talk about disparities, and we're going to get to why all this is important, because when I get to the point about what we're going to do about it and how we can actually mitigate these differences and how we can actually get more people onto clinical trials, and I said more people, I think that having a basic blocking understanding of our history and having a basic blocking, clear understanding of the terms are going to be important. I don't use health equity. Health equity is really an underlying principle and is a commitment to reducing ultimately and eliminating disparities in health and its drivers. Let me tell you, when I think of health differences between two groups, you can have health differences between two groups and not necessarily have a disparity. But let me point out for you, when I talk about disparities, that there is a specific optic on it. So, Dr. Nguyen, what do you mean by that? Let me just point out to you that Dr. Rose and some others have figured out that when it came to multiple myeloma and prostate cancer, that they have challenged what I have learned all of my life. Growing up and then becoming a young medical student and then a young doctor, I actually had the mantra that African-American men, just because they were African-American men, actually were going to have a poorer outcome from prostate cancer just because of my biology. It turns out that with more data, as Mark Twain would say, it ain't so. You see, when other folks like Rose and others have now been putting their attention to this, and both in things like multiple myeloma and prostate, it turns out that when you have access to care, to the same quality of care, to the same kind of docs, in the same kind of sequence of care, that ultimately things like prostate cancer, particularly in systems like the VA, you eradicate the differences between Black and white. I say that to you to point out that the same thing is true of multiple myeloma, and you can go on and looking at these other things. So while we have paid billions of dollars looking at various mutations, it turns out that in general, most of those mutations would respond to standard therapy. If we're really going to make a difference in eradicating cancer, particularly in the United States and hopefully globally, we're not going to have to just be enamored and fascinated with our high-tech approaches. We're going to have to be more enamored and aggressive and innovative with the cutting-edge, high-touch approaches that I think are necessary to bring folks to and give access to our therapies. I say this because when it is not about biology, when an African-American man and a white man dealing with prostate cancer could ultimately eradicate the differences between them, and it's not based on just simply their biology, but access, that's a social justice issue. That's a structural issue. Now, in part, let me just be honest that the structures aren't something that we created. Many of these structures existed before we even came and before we even got here. There are a number of factors leading to disparities, for example, in breast cancers. Lack of medical coverage, lack of actually effective screening, unequal access to treatment, and more importantly, unequal access to, I'm going to say it publicly, high impact, highly effective navigation strategies. Now, for me, it's wonderful to talk about reducing, for example, in cancer disparities and looking to do these things. But the reality is, it won't happen until we are all committed to the fact that while we are spending multiple and lots of energy on the developing new drugs, we have to be equally committed to reaching not just some of our communities, but all of our communities through what I consider to be more of a not bench to bedside model, but a community to bench model, otherwise known as a people to pipette model, in which we are understanding and getting the missing data, the missing omics from our community, so that back into our hands so that we can better understand how to come up with interventions and strategies. Now, I stopped using the word and I'll apologize to you ahead of time, but I stopped using the word determinants a little bit ago, because when I looked it up in a dictionary, it really almost seemed as if it was fatal, if it was a fait accompli. It turns out that what COVID showed me was that many of what we're referring to as determinants are really just drivers. Most academic centers, mine included, have focused more on the fundamental research and the downstream factors that cause the cancers, because since 1950, we've been fascinated with the understanding of the nature of the human cell and the disruptions in that and how it causes cancers, without understanding that DNA is heavily impacted by upstream drivers of health. And those upstream drivers have a unique way of sort of showing up. For example, what I like to say is that what I have learned over time is that your ZNA actually truly is probably much more impactful and certainly has an intersectionality and an impact on your DNA. Another way of saying that is that place and space matter. This is where I think that the ACS, unlike many other organizations, already has a ground game, already has an understanding and a history about the power of connectedness, about the power of understanding that as we get more communities connected and as we get more information into those communities, we might just have a fighting chance of reducing the burden of cancer. Let me give you just a quick example. This is something that I got from Steve Wolf, who's part of our faculty here at VCU, who's brilliant. We're picking on Chicago just for a second. The reality is the life expectancy, say in the Loop, which is the area right where the Magnificent Mile is. Let me put it better to you. It's the area where when Oprah Winfrey and Keanu Reeves come back to Chicago, that's where they're headed. It's full of shops, gyms, near the lake, access to physical activity. Literally only about 4 miles west, there's an area called West Garfield Park. The life expectancy drops by 16 years. And by the way, when you go 8 miles south, not shown on this picture, the life expectancy drops to 50. By 30 years. Now, before you all, think about this and start saying, oh yeah, Dr. Wynn, but that's great and everything like that. But the truth of the matter is, there's a lot of gun violence. There's a lot of that stuff happening in Chicago. Well, they went back and looked and saw that the life expectancies, and when you factor in gun violence and all of this, were negligible. This is not an issue, quote, of as we talk about people and, quote, their choices in life. Their choices are based on the menu that they get presented. When you actually have someone living in the Loop and they get to look at a menu of physical activities and what they can do, and there's a list of like 30 or 40, it's very different than someone from Inglewood about, again, 8 miles south with a 30% reduction in life expectancy, who have maybe a menu of 2. And maybe even those 2 places, they can only maybe use only when they have certain situations where it's deemed safe. Let's quit playing that this is an issue of personal choice. Yes, personal choice matters. But when I talk about navigation, this is not just about the precision medicine of getting to the right person, the right medicine. It's also understanding that we need to have much more of a precision sort of approach to understanding communities and what they are needing. That's the wonderful intervention of what I believe the new high-tech, high-touch sort of strategy gets me. Let's go back to COVID just for a second. I know no one wants to go back there, but let's just go back. When we were looking early in the vaccine, right? Remember this? It's only a few years ago. We were talking immediately about the disproportionate, inequitable sort of distribution of uptake of vaccines between Blacks and whites and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, remember that? And we came up with tons of reasons of why this happened. And we also started talking about all the issues about, the biology of the African Americans, and maybe they did less well. And it turns out that simply understanding that not only did it take getting an mRNA vaccine developed, a miracle drug, by the way, but it actually took the rolling up of our sleeves and getting into the community to eradicate the difference between Black, white, and Latino and white uptake of the vaccine. Don't play with me as if we don't know how to close the gap. Stop kidding yourselves that we don't actually understand the mechanisms that actually go into reducing the screening differences between Black, whites, and others around our communities or between rules. You know what it is? It turns out that while we have a fascination and a love affair with the high tech, we ought to also be equally in love with coming up with innovative strategies around the ground game of the high touch. It turns out we've been thinking about this for a while, but let me just tell you that in addition to the forerunners of the what I call navigation was the ACS ground game of getting communities and educating communities, we also had a champion, and his name is Harold P. Freeman, a surgeon who became a surgeon because he thought he wanted to definitely deal issues with Black women, particularly with breast cancer, but came to a recognition that when he couldn't cut it out, because most of the women who were coming to him were coming in such advanced and late stages in Harlem, he recognized that he had to get a jump on this disease by getting out to them and having them be navigated to care. Dr. Freeman was one of the first people that I knew, and it remains a hero of mine, who understood that there was a disconnect, and a critical disconnect between the discovery of new sciences and the delivery of that sciences. And I'm actually going to put one more gap in there, that the delivery, health delivery systems of that science to our community. Why am I excited? I'm excited because as we look at the opportunities now at the NIH and the National Cancer Institute, it really is about not only the discovery of new stuff, but outcomes and the impact we have on outcomes. I say that to you because we've been fascinated by big data. Oh my God, we've been so fascinated by big data, and we're starting to talk about AI and all the miracles it's going to do. But let it be known that while we actually have all a fascination with all the omics, right? The genomics and the phenomics and the lipidomics, there's an important omic that is missing, and an important omic that actually I think is essential to what I call highly effective navigation strategies. And that is the missing omic of our community. It's interesting that when we start talking about certain communities, we are fascinated that the fact, and we keep going on and on until I point out that there are absolutely data deserts in certain communities. Now, the cool part about this story, for me, is that we're starting to understand as navigators and as people who understand, as I told someone, how do we talk to one another? And, I had a meeting once and bought, it was my fault, so I don't blame anyone else. It was me. I bought some of what I considered my best scientists. I bought them on the 14th, in the 14th ward on the south side of Chicago, and just wanted to have a community interaction with my best scientists. And one of them actually, unfortunately, said something so crazy. He said, well, we know that you all are scientifically illiterate and health illiterate. And oh my goodness. I had I think she was around 85 or 87-year-old woman, took her time and got her way to the mic, and actually asked the young person who helped her get to the mic, said, illiterate. She said, well, we might be scientifically illiterate, but you illiterate too. It turns out that while we are sitting behind our desk and while we're doing all these wonderful things, sometimes we don't do what I would call the simplest thing that requires humility in the concept of it ain't what you know, but what you know for sure. Like, for example, African-Americans don't want to be part of your trial because of their distrust and mistrust. That's some BS. I said it. I know somebody's written about it in a paper, but I'm telling you that when I am in my Danville, when I'm on my south side Chicago, when I'm on the east end of Richmond, when I'm in areas of Southeast DC, it ain't about them sort of, and by the way, why shouldn't they mistrust and have low trust? These are the same people who during the COVID period said, well, these people won't take the vaccine. That's crazy. It turns out that when you actually had the humility of getting to know them and putting people within those neighborhoods and actually communicating in an effective way, as WBH would say, think like the wisest of men and women, but communicate in the language of people. We frequently don't communicate in the language of the people. We frequently, when it comes to clinical trials, can't simply say to a community here on the east end of Richmond, now listen, y'all, when you in the standard of medical care, what else is there in cancer? And everyone says, I don't know. And I answer to them in the 21st century, the standard of care and the extension of care is the access to clinical trials. All of a sudden, that congregation, those folks said, huh, how come no one ever told me that? Well, we didn't tell you that because we were under the assumption that everybody just knows what we know. And everybody, interestingly enough, can't know because there is a bilingualism to the way we need to communicate. There's a bilingualism that understands that when we are communicating to one another versus when we're communicating to the community, that while we are, quote, communicating, it ain't a dumbed down process. It's trying to be an effective communicator. I hate that word. Well, we need to dumb things down. No, this 87-year-old woman came to the mic and said, you scientifically, you illiterate. As she said to my science, you illiterate too. And there's some humility that needs to go with the context of our great institutions, also understanding that we are illiterate in the context of being effective communicators and being the humble communicators we need to know. That starts with humility and understanding how do we effectively communicate by listening and by collecting those omics in the data that are now currently missing. We've been running around building trust for, God knows, 40 plus years, and we talk about building trust, but let me just put this to you just quickly and as succinctly as I can. Building trust, the community gives us their trust. But why isn't it that we have not even thought to start thinking about our own institutional trustworthiness? And how do we work on that credibility? How do we work on that dependability? How do we work on the transferability of what we're saying? And how do we work on the fact that we are, doing things within the community of showing up, showing out, and making certain that even after the grant is done, that we are still there. I put this character, Snidely Whiplash, for those of you who don't know and too young, I may be the only one that knows this, is that there used to be a cartoon that came out when I was a kid that grew up, was called Dudley Do-Right. And turns out he was a Canadian Mountie and he always did everything right. His nemesis was this guy, what you see right in the center of this, called Snidely Whiplash. Now he's wearing a stovetop hat and he has a crazy little sinister mustache there, and he just looks crazy, right? Now, Snidely Whiplash, you may not know in this picture, has a heart of gold, and all he really wants to do is to actually do some good. But to most of our community, we come to them and we look like Snidely Whiplash, not because that's who we say we are, but that's because of the history. And we ask them, well, they don't trust us, as opposed to how do we work on our own institutional trustworthiness? By the way, institutional trustworthiness can be developed by toolkits and can be measured. I think we're onto something different here. I think that when we think about clinical trials, we know the importance of clinical trials. We don't always talk to, quote, at-risk communities about it because we say to them crazy things like, well, we know there's Tuskegee and we know that you people wouldn't want to. How you know? In fact, I'm going to be absolutely transparent here and say that there were at least a handful of middle school dances that I attended that I did not dance all night. And when I would go to one of my friends that actually complained about it, one of my friends had probably what was then a life lesson. He said, well, did you ask? And I would say no. Not only don't we sometimes not ask our communities that should be also benefiting from these miracles, but sometimes we're so awkward in the context of how we ask. fact, I once had someone to dance one time. She said no, and then I had to laugh at myself because I was so awkward. I would have said no too, to myself. We don't talk about the effectiveness of our messages within our community. And when they say no, we essentially write them off. But I'm here to tell you that in our lifetimes, we have seen what you can do when it matters to us. When we valued that everyone got that mRNA vaccine, when we started really thinking about our ground game and started thinking about how do we actually not just, quote, educate our communities, but how do we actually activate our communities in understanding the importance of this. I'll end with the fact that it's not enough just to have a diverse workforce or a diverse navigation crew. Turns out that you can have a whole diverse workforce, but if they learn only one way of approach and they don't learn the importance of actually how to look at communities and do community asset mapping before they actually complete their trials, they'll still design high impact trials and implement, but again, they have no idea of how to get those trials and how to activate those trials and activate confidence and actually have that sense of trustworthiness that allows for more patients to get on your trials. Yes, it's about having a diverse workforce, but it's beyond having a diverse workforce. It's also about teaching that and training that diverse workforce and understanding that while we absolutely want them to continue to be the best when it comes to designing and implementing trials, we also want them to be aware that communities do have assets, communities have champions, community activators that can actually help in bringing trust, in bringing these other things that will allow more people to trust us to actually receive and be open to these therapies. When I came up with the Bristol Myers Squibb fellowship program, I worked with them. It was right after George Floyd, and they called and said, Dr. Nguyen, do you have any ideas about how to do something big and how do we do something? And I said, I absolutely do. And that was the genesis really of understanding that I think we needed to train the first generation of clinical trialists in the United States who actually understood the importance of trials, clinical, design and implementation, but also the importance in learning the skill set, because it's not just something you just do, the skill set and the rigor around being good outreach and engagement people as well. I'll end with this. I actually think, and I'm super optimistic, that we're finally at a place and a time where there is so much excitement in the context of the people that we can reach. But that we're going to have to understand that it's not enough just to have health system navigators who, while well-meaning, are going to our neighborhoods, are not connected with our neighborhoods. In fact, as a Southside Chicago person, some would say to me, listen, I ain't talking to nobody who ain't sent you. We have to be worried about the who sent you. Those people who can help us with that, the ACS already know, are infrastructures and embedded within that infrastructure within our communities. Our communities are asking us to be the problem solvers and be the providers of solutions to their problems. And it, unfortunately, is not just going to happen because we get yet the next 800th immunotherapy drug that's actually out to the market. It's going to be with the efforts of the ACS and efforts of people like you of understanding that we may have to actually have a 2.0 version of navigation in which we actually look at this as not just one standard fit all, but multi-level navigation that starts with building trust within the communities and having community activators that can be connected. It may look like having financial folk and social workers wrapped around, not at the end, but at the beginning, to understand that families also want to be healthy. And by the way, let's quit playing this game that there is something wrong with our communities. Understand that the risk of increased risk of prostate cancer in African-American men is certainly not just baked in their biology, but it is baked in the concept of the reality is that many of those neighborhoods, due to redlining and many of those neighborhoods, due to structural issues, are living next to highways and other things that have worse air. For example, we know that communities of color are disproportionately living in areas where they're exposed to particulate matter 2.5, which we know is a cancer driver. Let's quit playing. We know that many of our particularly underrepresented groups in urban areas are living within heat islands that we know also contribute. The reality is the movement of 1930 that still has Chicago very segregated, of deciding who could get a house loan, was also built on science. We call it redlining now, redlining, we talk about it as if, but that redlining came out of the science of the time that people knew for sure was called eugenics, that said that African-Americans didn't have the brain capability to pay back a loan as much as a white person. That from the 1930s still persists now. And when we, in the 1950s, started building white roads through Black bedrooms called the Urban Renewal Project, we had no actually real understanding that we were having communities being exposed to things that would be within the genome or that zip code neighborhood association that would impact their biology. Quit playing with me that it's all just a personal issue, and understanding that getting back to our roots as the ACS, that communities matter. Communities cannot and can no longer be invisible. There's rich data within those communities that we could better use to be able to refine not only our scientific questions and refine our trials, but refine our approaches in the context of high impact interventions. I want to thank you, and I may have gone over my time and I apologize, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just say thank you for all that you all are out there doing. It is absolutely clear to me that the decisions and the effectiveness of tomorrow will depend on our creativity, our courage, and our ability to take risks in the context of new models of navigation. And a humility to understand that actually many of the answers are already there. We just have to have the humbleness and understanding and the ability to be able to listen to what our communities have been telling us all along. It's not that they don't want our therapies. What they're saying is, I'll put it in my vernacular, step to them right. Talk to them in a way in which we're not, quote, dumbing down any doggone thing. We're just making it more effective as we would with any other situation so that people can understand and mobilize. Appreciate you for the time. And again, this is one of my favorite organizations, and I don't really know, because this is the way I know I get myself kicked out of things, but Linda and Heather, I thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you all today.
Thank you. I thank you just so much. I mean, I think even in some of the chat and such a powerful, thought-provoking, and honestly, in some strange way, inspirational presentation to really help us think about what do we do? I mean, we have on the webinar here today, almost 300 people who are navigators in the field, people who are program leaders. And I guess I just want to start out with one question, and then I'll kind of go to what's in the Q&A, and maybe it's too big of a question, so just say that. But I think one of the things that really hits me from what you're saying is, how do we be advocates in our own organizations? Because I think one of what you're talking about is, yes, there are tools, and we'll come back to that, because I think some of the questions really are the action items for me as a navigator. How do I help a patient really through this process? But I think you also sort of talk about this dual role we have of advocating within our own organizations to address these issues. And I don't know if you have like one action we can take, because we don't have much time, but like one thing, if you could tell us all to go do it, what would you tell us to do?
Absolutely. So I thank you for that question. So I'll make it real quick. For example, we know that molecular testing, biomarker testing for cancers is probably the right thing to do. Turns out though, unless you're poor and you're on Medicaid or Medicare, where you have to ultimately wait for 14 days before you can even activate, right? We have cases, and you know many of them, that we're, as navigators and as health advocates, we are trying to say, let's do the right thing and let's give access to our communities. And yet, when we actually come to the very same tool that's supposed to help, the voices need to be raised about, why is it that if I make $2 billion, I can actually get my health biomarkers right at the beginning. And if I'm on Medicare or Medicaid, all of a sudden, the 14-day wait period and the copay all of a sudden becomes an obstacle. This is what I love about us as navigators, because we used to, in some ways, think about science as evolving, but so does navigation. It too gets more complicated, but as it gets complicated and it gets more tough, there is a wonderfulness about that. Just like I want to solve big problems in science, I love solving these big problems around navigation. I actually think the one thing you're doing is what you're doing. We're talking more about it. We used to be so freaking fragmented. Oh my God. I can't tell you the number of times where navigators, it's navigation this, and the nurses navigators, and this navigator, and that navigator. But there wasn't a one voice, a one team, one fight sort of approach. But you guys are starting to say, let's bring all of our levels of navigators together to figure out how James Brown would say how we can all get on the one. That's what I love about what you all are doing. You're starting a conversation about how can we get our very fragmented navigation activities aligned better. If I had to say one thing, that's what I'm a hardcore advocate for, about getting all of our different types of navigation aligned in a better way than we have in the past.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think both within our own organizations and in the field, at those multi-levels. And I think one of the questions here that I see is really about this whole issue about transportation resources. This is someone who works in very rural communities with financial geographic limitations. And sort of what are your thoughts, or have you seen like successful approaches to really, until we can find a way that those trials have to finance it, which maybe that's something we need to be advocating for. Any thoughts about that? Because I think that is a major issue, and it's not just an issue in rural communities. I think it's worse in rural communities, but taking 3 buses to get to a cancer center is challenging as well. So any thoughts about that?
Yes, and not to sound like Roshan Roland Kirk, but I'm going to give you the 2 paths of where we are now and why I'm so proud to be part of the ACS. The whole transportation vouchers and all the rest of that, you guys, we're doing that. But here's something that I think about the now. I mean, once they answered Wayne Gretzky, he was one of the greatest hockey players. Why is he around the puck so much? And he famously responded, most people play hockey for where the puck is. I play it for where it's going. So let's talk about the fact that we need to do both. The vouchers, the transportation now. But I'm going to argue that most of our cancer medicine is now becoming oral. We're even talking about having early detection, things like that, that don't need a CAT scan, but actually maybe can be done through just the act of getting blood. If this is all true, our future means that when we're more nimble and more mobile, maybe we can get some of this care actually closer to the communities. But where's the infrastructure? The infrastructure's got to be built on figuring out that it's not just enough to have someone 200 miles away, but how are we going to think about building and connecting with the frontier communities? You know, the funny part is many people over the world have thought about these issues, and I think it's high time now that we start thinking about not only our medicines, not only about how to get people to us, but what things can we move to them? I think both can be done. And that's why I'm super excited. If I seem optimistic, I will say to you, Linda and Heather, I did not intentionally, because I wanted to be on my best behavior, so I didn't drink coffee this morning because I didn't want to be so hyped up. I will have a cup after I'm done here, though. But I will tell you that I am excited about our futures, because it's about transportation, it's about housing, but it's about building also a navigation infrastructure that are nearing and closer to those areas. It's not always the MD. And I think that we're finally getting to a place where we can start seeing how and why and where, with more information, where we could have those interventions to be more impactful. So I'm excited about our future.
And we need to be excited about the future. We need to keep being innovative, right? And really address this. And I think I'll just throw out one last one, because I know I want to turn it back to Heather. And maybe this is something we can come back to and share it, sort of one of the future webinars. There's a question about promising practices dealing with health literacy. So as we think about this communication to patients, I think, it's both health literacy, but I think as you talked about, sort of really understanding the community. So we're we're talking in a way that people can understand. But I don't know if you have a quick 1 minute on that, and then I'm going to let Heather.
Absolutely. You know, the best example of this is I had a handful of my senior leaders work with the community, and we called it a community education sort of blah, blah, blah. It turns out it wasn't them educating the community. It was the community educating them. I had one of my senior leaders say to me, Rob, this was the most uncomfortable and the most humbling experience I ever had.
Mm.
And in fact, the person didn't graduate. We had kind of like a pseudo graduation. They couldn't graduate until the community member that they were working with, felt that they could communicate effectively enough so that they would understand what the hell it was that they were doing. And it was the first time one of my senior leaders sort of said, it's the first time I had to put the mirror up to myself.
Mm.
And it was the first time he actually, and he said, it's the last time that I'm going to talk about the illiteracy of the community, because it's clear that I'm also illiterate in the context of the bilingualism that is necessary in being an effective communicator. So I think we're moving in that direction. And again, I think that it's the humility is not weakness, humility is power.
Yeah. Amen to that. Thank you so much. I mean, really, this is so inspirational, and I think has so set us up for the rest of this series, and really kind of what we have to keep coming back to. So I can't thank you enough. And I want to turn things back to Heather to kind of wrap us up.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate you guys.
Yes, and I again want to express my gratitude and thanks to you. I expected to be awed and inspired, and you kind of blew me out of the water. For all of you who were listening intently, we did record this. You will get a copy of the recordings. You can listen to it, share it with your friends. I'm sure, like me, you were saying, oh, so-and-so has to hear this because it's so amazing. So we will share out the recording. Looking forward to us continuing the conversation. We have some other great experts. We're going to talk about kind of the building of the practice and the delivering of the practice. And this is the beginning of our webinar series. So please take some time to complete the evaluation, to share with us what you'd like to see future programming. And I want to again thank our sponsors. Without the sponsorship for this initiative, we wouldn't be able to bring you this great programming. So sponsorship was led by AstraZeneca and the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies, Johnson & Johnson, along with Bristol Myers Squibb. Additional sponsors include GlaxoSmithKline, Daiichi Sankyo, Novocure, Pfizer, Sanofi, and other funders. And stay tuned, lots of great things coming your way. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. And have a wonderful afternoon and go out and do good work.